Hi, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I finally figured out a name that I would like to use, and it's something I've been doing here and there, but never consistently. So we can call this not morning musings, of course. That would be funny, right? Ha ha. No, this is Middleism apologetics. And what we're dealing with, of course, is providing a refutation and an objection to the preterist paradigm as presented by Don Preston, Ed Stevens, William Bell, and other men who are teaching such false doctrines. And so I want to thank you guys for hanging in there who come and subscribe and share. Really appreciate it. Slowly gaining ground. But that's fine. I have a lot more detractors than I have people who are happy with me. But that's fine because I'm presenting a case I think that is absolutely theologically sound. And, well, I'm still waiting for refutation from somebody else and from other predators. And all they can say is you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. But they can't actually demonstrate where or why. So I will continue as I'm going right now. And in today's topic, as we've been dealing with what was fulfilled and all the implications of that, the passing of the law, the transition from 33 to 70 AD, those 40 years, and all of those things that we're talking about. I've built up a case in the last 3 videos or so, and now I'm in this one here. I'm going to be directly responding to Don Preston's video of Matthew 5:17 through 18, number 09. Could 2 laws exist side by side? And of course, I'll put the link up in the blog, and I've been tying all these videos in with my blog so that you have the written out of my notes and things specifically that will end up being part of probably a new book, and then the specific arguments of the video, so they're tying it together and have them together. Plus the video, of course, will be on the YouTube channel to start with, and then added to the blog. And that blog, of course, is middleism.org/WordPress-WP. And of course that link will be floating around there somewhere. So getting into this right now, where we're at is that in this video, Don claims that the Old Covenant existed after his resurrection. And this is what he claims, is that it existed. The Old Covenant was around. It was still there. It was enforceable. The Jews were following. And if that is true, then all the Jews were required and obligated to keep it. Now, catch the power of that, right, Don? If you say it existed and God was honoring that thing, then the people were required to follow that. And that is the charge laid against you by other people. You might never said such a written thing, but the implication remains. If God said the Old Covenant still existed, then Jews, were obligated to keep it still since it did not end. They were only not obligated to follow the law if it ends. You can't follow something. You can't follow a contract. You can't be part of a contract if one of the party dies or if it ends. In the case of the Old Covenant, it was the parties who died, correct? So in his video analogy, he used East Berlin as an example of them living under the law of Moses. And once they escaped to the other side, they died to the law of Moses, entered in freedom in West Berlin. So that explains why they could both exist at the same time. Well, his whole premise here assumes that East Berlin is the Old Covenant and that it existed. So you have to say that you have to prove that it existed. Don never did that. No, all he did was bring up this analogy, but he never proved why. And scripturally, he cannot prove why the covenant did not end. Now, using his arguments about 70 AD and the typology and everything, so we're going to get into that in a second. But what you need to catch the power of is Don using East Berlin to describe the Jews who are still living under the Old Covenant. So if his analogy was to be theologically correct, what Paul is actually saying here was the wall was torn down. There was no law keeping Jews inside of East Berlin. They could cross freely over at any time, but they were choosing not to. That would be the correct analogy. You can't say the law ended and the wall came down because God initiated a new covenant. Because there is a new covenant, the wall between the two was divided, just as Paul was talking about the wall dividing between Jews and Gentiles was long gone. So in your analogy, you have to assume that the law of Moses still exists, and it did not add the cross, but nothing that you do explains that whatsoever, or why. But what in fact it's proven above that from God's perspective, Jesus fulfilled the terms of the old covenant and ended it so that a new one could be written. Okay, now you went on to say all of the symbols and the ceremonies were finally fulfilled in AD 70. Symbols and the ceremonies all pointing to what? The sacrificial system. They all pointing to Jerusalem's destruction. So let's put it, he built all this temple, initiated all the sacrifices that were done within the temple, and it's all to point to its destruction. Does that sound correct? Or do all the symbols and the ceremonies and everything about the temple point to Christ himself, who fulfills everything by being the one-time sacrifice? See, you're trying to sit there and argue that the utensils used in a meal is the actual meal, when it's not. It's what you're eating. The food is the important part, not what you eat the meal with. That's my analogy. I'm sorry, but that becomes untrue premise and assertion from Protestant, and it's just not theologically correct. All the symbols and ceremonies pointed to Christ's death. And as a nation, they were responsible for his death of his son, who they rejected. In the parable of the vineyard of Luke 20, 9 through 18, he speaks of the judgment that comes upon the bad servants. So what came upon Jerusalem was that judgment and the curses. Now, in Dart's argument, he claims that if the covenant ended at the cross, the wrath could not be poured out on Jerusalem according to the terms of the old covenant to their end. See, if wrath for sin was poured out on the cross, then all wrath ended, and Jerusalem could not be destroyed under the terms of the old. That's the point he's making. Well, here's your problem. Jerusalem was not destroyed according to the terms of the old covenant, meaning while its destruction was prophesied to come, it was not part of the legal requirements of the law, meaning national judgment is always separate from the sacrificial system for the individual. The judgments was a national judgment that came on Israel in 70 AD for the rejection of Christ, as the individuals are doing. There's no other way to explain that. Jesus Christ didn't come to save them nationally. He came to save people from their sins, the individual, not to save them nationally. If that was true, then his death would have atoned for the whole nation, since a blood sacrifice occurred under the terms of the old covenant. Then they would have all been saved, and therefore they would have never had been destroyed. And that is what we would call universalism. But that's not what's being argued theologically by Paul. The judgments that was to come upon Jerusalem in AD 70 was for the rejection. It was not for the violation of the law by the people. Get this straight. Matthew 23. Why was judgment coming upon that generation and those people? For the righteous blood of Cain and Abel. From Cain all the way through Zechariah. All those prophets. This was vindication for their blood, not for the people's violation of the covenant. Do you get that? This is national judgment against them for what they did. That is the distinction and the difference. So President's theological errors, he's mixing personal guilt of sin with corporate sin of the nation. Christ died for the sin of the individual, not for the sin of the nation who rejected him and killed his son who he sent to save. So here's the thing. If they reject the redemption offered to them under the old covenant, then they are not redeemed from the judgment of the old covenant. Do you catch the power of that? The redemption offered to them was under the old covenant. They were not redeemed from the judgment of the old covenant. Got it? If they reject the redemption offered to them under the old covenant, then they are not redeemed from the judgment of the old covenant. They are still going to be judged as a nation for their failure because they rejected the redemption that was being brought to them. Sodom and Gomorrah were never under the covenant, yet suffered judgment for their sin as a nation because of God's sovereignty over the nation. So it had nothing to do with covenant relationship, especially with Sodom and Gomorrah. The nation of Israel killed his son. Judgment came upon them as a nation apart from any conditions of the covenant. Yet we see the curses in the law upon the nation for their failures as a nation fulfilled as well. So when the people of Nineveh repented, the judgment came that was declared against them was withheld. So if the nation of Israel had repented, the judgment had been withheld, but Moses foresaw that was not going to happen. So, I hope you get the whole idea that is that redemption under the old covenant was offered by a blood sacrifice. They rejected it, therefore they were subject to the judgments, which is separate from the law, and it's separate from the curses and things, because this is nationalistic that we're talking about. I hope that point comes across clearly to people. So passing away, he begins to rehash, of course, the issues of 5:18. And we've already dealt with that in those last videos. So, well, the heaven and earth being referred to here is not the literal creation according to full price, but it's code language for the temple. Therefore, when the temple passed away, so did the law of Moses. And it's simply astounding, that Luke's own statement is never used by full price. John never mentions this. And it sheds light on the whole what Matthew is saying and the sentence that's being used. So, proper exegesis is a tool that's supposed to be used, and it requires every verse on the subject. So if they don't look up those other verses and deal with them, they're going to fall short. They're going to fall short. Those are the only two phrases that are used in all of that, and why they're not put together is just simply amazing to me. Amazing. Okay, I am going to conclude here and finish up with part 2 on the next part, where I'm going to be dealing with Don's book. And where he's toward to Telos, where the end, where again he is arguing the whole thing, and I'm just going to go and bring out some brief points about that. So, thank you for listening. I asked some questions. In this one, I don't feel like I really explained everything real clearly, but it's kind of a difficult concept to understand that the judgment that came on Jerusalem was nationalistic for the blood of Cain, from Abel all the way to Zechariah. And this is a national judgment for their sins, not the individual sins that Christ died for on the cross. There's that distinction. So, thank you for listening. Pass it on, share it on, wrestle with it. Help me wrestle with it some more if you want, and we'll talk about it later. You guys have a good night. We'll see you. Bye.